Good evening, everyone. Thanks for making it this evening. A beautiful summer's night. We've got the doors open, breeze flowing through, coffee's on. Been a very pleasant evening to date. So welcome to those that are here especially, and to those on Zoom. And with a bit of luck, we've got ATV running as well. I'd like to introduce Mark, VK3 MDH, a colleague who managed to pass his licence qualifications with me, which is, for me, it was very surprising. For Mark, I think he did it easy.
Surprised that I passed.
No, I was surprised I passed. But anyway, I scraped through, I think.
We had good teachers, right, Dave?
But, good to see you here. Thanks for coming this evening, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming along tonight. I'd just like to start off with an acknowledgement. Lead on and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Could I ask, is anyone in the room here ever worked for any of our emergency services? Thank you for your service. And has anyone here volunteer in any capacity? Well, in the past, in the club, other organisations? Thank you again for taking time to volunteer. As Martin has said, my name's Mark Hudson, VK3 MDH. I did my 2 lots of qualifications here at EMDRC. And I do a few different things. I'm an emergency responder, and I'm in the private sector, and we deal with road, rail and marine incidents. So think of a rolled fuel tanker. Somebody has to climb up on it and decant it. And we deal a lot with chemicals and other nasty things in accidents. I'm also a hazardous area and dangerous goods consultant, and I deal a lot with, again, chemicals, dangerous goods, safety, audits, compliance, and that sort of stuff. As I said, WICEN, I'm the state membership officer, and I've been with WICEN, I think now for 8 or 9 years. And I have an advanced degree in emergency management, and I'm still at uni and trying to get my bachelor's completed. Emergency response is a way of life. Emergencies never happen when it's convenient, and you may also find when you work in that space, not everyone shares the same passion. It's just something that I've kind of learned over the years. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk a couple of things. One, it's a little bit about the emergency management framework in Victoria that WICEN works within. Talk a little bit about some of the things WICEN have been doing, and then look at emergency communications and preparedness, and also what clubs can do to benefit the community and using the resources and talents that a club has. At the start of every disaster movie, there's a scientist being ignored. So, brief little history on WICEN. It was established in 1980. It has been accredited within the State Emergency Response Plan. That's what it's referred to today, the SEMP. Years ago, it might have been called the DIS Plan. And we're associated with the Wireless Institute, and we are activated under that State Emergency Response Plan by Victoria Police. If you're not familiar with these terms, don't worry about it, but there's essentially 4 pillars of emergency management. It's PPR. There are potentially 5, and that's when we talk about mitigation, but there is prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. And a lot what we'll talk about tonight is preparedness and response. These photos were taken a week and a half ago from up in the Dandenongs. I don't know if anyone lives up there. I do. We're out electricity for about a week, and we certainly didn't have phone coverage for about that same period of time, whether it was Telstra or Optus. And in fact, the local school principal, to have a discussion with his boss, had to drive down to the Ferntree Gully car park to hold a conversation. So it was pretty inconvenient because we get used to that convenience. So response, And these definitions all come tonight from the Australian Institute of Disaster Recovery. So they're common definitions that are used by most, if not all, emergency services. And there's a lot of familiarity with these globally as well. So when we talk about the response, it's the actions taken in anticipation during and immediately after an emergency. So in other words, the response phase of an event is the turning up, getting the call and turning up. And it's normally when there's a lot of chaos and a lot of moving parts are happening at once. Then there's the recovery phase. And the recovery phase is the restoring or improving of the livelihoods and health, as well as the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets, and blah, 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 blah. So the recovery aspect after a disaster has happened, and we'll talk about that definition in a moment. Essentially, the recovery phase is the clean up, the mop up, and that can go on for days, weeks, and years, where the response phase of an incident can normally be hours or days, maybe weeks. So what's the difference between an emergency and a disaster? Whose footy team didn't win last year? That was probably a disaster, wasn't it? Who didn't bring milk home when the wife asked? That's an emergency. But so an emergency is an event which endangers or threatens property, life, the environment, which requires significant or coordinated response. But a disaster is when most of that response is going to come from outside that area. The community or the area in which that event is taking place, whether it's a natural disaster or could be a man-made event or a terrorist event. The capacity of those services in the community within that affected area, they can't handle it. They've got to call for help outside. So typically when we talk emergency communications, we're talking about disasters. We're not talking about, a car accident on a freeway or a house burning down. It's normally when a cyclone, storm, fire, a large natural event has taken place. So in Victoria, there is the State Emergency Management Plan, the SEMP. And that is quite a complex series of documents that goes from the state right down to the municipal level. And there is a ton of plans. They're easy to find online, and there is a plan for everything. And there are sub-plans. So there is quite a lot of documentation that the emergency services people use when it comes to an event. Who is the control agency? Who is the command agency? So a flood event, the SES are the agency who takes a lead. Fire, people like the CFA. So these documents are well constructed, regularly revised, and they are the legal framework that in the state of Victoria, and they exist in other states, but we're only talking about Victoria tonight, where we as WICEN are involved with. So what does EMV, which is Emergency Management Victoria, have to say about WICEN? So this is what it says in their document. The Wireless Institute Civil Emergency Network, WICEN, which I think we saw earlier, started around 1980. Maybe not the best word for today to describe the organisation, but it's a word that comes from, I believe, a lot of ex-servicemen returning from maybe World War II, where a lot of ex-servicemen were put to work in policing and security, and we had things like the Civil Emergency Network. And it consists of a number of state and territory volunteer emergency communications organisations. And we provide emergency radio networks that can be assembled quickly, taking advantage of both amateur frequencies and other agencies' non-amateur frequency allocations. Each WICEN entity operates under a different appropriate state emergency management and other disaster plans. It's one of the questions that gets asked often, WICEN Victoria, while there is affiliations and relationships with, say, WICEN in New South Wales, we are individual organisations. WICEN in New South Wales is part of the Volunteer Rescue Association, the VRA. So often, if WICEN, if you are a member of WICEN New South Wales, you may be deployed out in support of an agency in New South Wales. But while you're a member of WICEN New South Wales, you're there as VRA. It'd be like the SES, I was going to say the SAS, the SES having a radio arm that was WICEN Victoria. So every WICEN entity, Tasmania, Western Australia, as an example, South Australia, are their own individual organisations, and we're not directly affiliated with each other. While there may be a relationship where you may share ideas and lessons learnt, for example, we are individual organisations. So within that state emergency response plan, under how they describe WICEN, it tells other agencies what WICEN is supposed to do within that plan. So WICEN is to participate and support local government in organising and conducting exercises identifying different communication strategies. The dot points you see there, I've just cut and paste that straight out of the document, so it references back to the document. But the important things are the words that are used in that document. We work with other agencies to provide alternative limited capability for emergency radio communications where required. We provide limited capability communications between response, relief and recovery agencies. So you think, like we talked about before, people like VicPol, CFA, SES are sort of response agencies, and people involved with recovery might be people like the Red Cross or other volunteer organisations. But two different phases there of an event, and that's under the operational management. And then they talk further about the response, provide appropriately trained radio operators, provide limited capability between those agencies, and work with the other agencies. You're reiterating some of what I've said earlier. Participate and support local government. This is all just coming straight out of their document. So that's what it says in the state emergency management plan. So when someone says, but WICEN hasn't been in the government's plans since 1987, it's not true. That's what's in the legal documents as of, I think it was November last year, it was updated. So unless something's happened in the last 3 months, it's still up online. That's what it says. And that's what it says WICEN's role is. So I had a conversation a little earlier about activations and about WICEN being used, and we'll talk further about that as the presentation goes on. I certainly wasn't around down in Victoria. I grew up in Sydney, but I've been in Victoria probably since about the early 90s. But certainly WICEN was used through many of those large events. And in fact, our last deployment was in November of 2022 to Wentworth, over the border from Mildura into New South Wales. And I'll talk in detail about that a little later on. So as we know, when a natural disaster strikes, the first link to fail is communications. And that was tested a week and a half, I think, or two and a half weeks ago now, up in the Dandenongs, where we got belted. Telephones and radio antennas are brought down. Portable radio systems provide inadequate use for a lot of the terrain. Power infrastructure may fail, and it certainly did. Mobile phone networks become overloaded, and it did. And communications via internet are unreliable. Or, as we know now, once the NBN goes, we lose our landline. So there goes your internet. And if your modem switches over to the GSM network, if your GSM towers are down, well, that's not going to work either. And all those things took place 2.5 weeks ago. So with all that in mind and getting to talking a little bit about some of the things that WICEN do, I'm just going to quickly go through part of a presentation that Chris, VK3CKG, did, one of our regional commanders down in the Gippsland area. And this was in 2018. And it's pretty much aligned with exactly what happened 2.5 weeks ago, where down in the Gippsland area, we worked with the local government agencies down there, or local government areas, several LGAs, in formulating an exercise where we would simulate this scenario. And that was a widespread failure of the electricity grid, where power went, telephones went, and the internet went. And this was between the Baw Baw Shire and this Latrobe City Shire. And there were some agreed objectives, and that was to demonstrate the ability to establish and operate independent communications between those two shires, within each of those LGAs, and to test the interface between the LGAs and other participating organisations, and to test their satellite phones. So across that area, we had deployed some operators, and operators that were set up in, if you would like to call it, an EOC, an Emergency Operations Centre. In some of the areas, some other areas were delegated more like a relief centre where people would come in. So we had operators in relief centres and operators at the EOCs. And there was a communications plan constructed, and there was a backbone on HF digitally that was used to communicate between the two MECCs. MECCs is not a term currently in their nomenclature anymore, but between the two MECs, think of it as an emergency operations centre, and then we had other operators using voice between locations. So there was quite an extensive plan put together. That's kind of a high-level overview. And the outcomes were that we had secure data links, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the HF data system that's used in a minute. We had voice links that were established and that were operational. And the messages that received were successful, that were being passed. So part of the training exercise was for council people to come to the radio operator and say, hey, I need 50 packets of toilet paper and, you know, all this sort of stuff, and messages were successfully passed. And we tested their satellite phones. The interesting thing that they realized with satellite phones is you can't use them inside. So it was like, well, what message do you want to pass? Hang on, but you can't do that. You have to go outside, write down the message and come in. So there was quite a lot of lessons learned from that, which I'm not going to go through, but that's a typical training exercise that we will do with an LGA or several LGAs to demonstrate the capability of, we'll call it amateur radio or emergency communications radio, that's outside the framework of the core agencies. One of the most recent activation for WICEN was to Wentworth, which is in New South Wales, just over the border, in November of 2022. It was over the border, but we had one of our members living in that township just over the border. At that time, with the amount of flooding that was taking place across the state, discussions with WICEN New South Wales, it was going to take 16 hours, I think, for them to deploy, if they could, to that region, because they had to go via, I think it was Canberra down to Gundagai and across. And that was the same for WICEN ACT. They had the same issue, where out of Victoria, once we got on the road, our deployment was 7.5 hours. So it was a much easier a request for us. So essentially the request was made on the 16th of November for support for the SES for communications in Wentworth, New South Wales. WICEN met the following day and advised the possibility of deployment to members. Immediate consultation and discussion was held with WICEN New South Wales and ACT to see if we could do things better, faster. And a formal request to WICEN was then to our members was put out on that same day, on the 17th. The following day, on the 18th, 4 deployed, and we were on the ground in Wentworth by 1700 hours. So you can just see how quick things moved over essentially 2 to 3 days. So often when disasters strike, it's not you've got a week and a half to think about it, or put a form into the boss to say I want leave in a month's time. You have a very short time to essentially, the word I use is spin up. We carried out multiple missions with local and interstate SES crews. SES were represented there from New South Wales, Northern Territory, and I think Queensland. We had HF voice and WinLink gateways available to us as support, but ultimately they weren't needed. So while some of our members were unable to deploy, they were able to make sure that their WinLink gateways were available to us, and they were able to monitor their HF radio if it was needed. And on Monday the 21st, we were stood down. So you could see it was very quick to spin up, and about 3 days on the ground with them before returning. So overall about a 6-day deployment. These are some of the photos from Wentworth. And there's Phil, VK3 PGS, who was our member on the ground up there, lucky enough to have a coffee. And you can just see some of the water levels there. And it's not all about radio. We actually spent one of the days helping out at the local sandbagging day, and helping out police and fire services. And we're doing everything from traffic control to helping out people where to park their cars, and a few of us occasionally got into loading sandbags, but that's heavy work. There's some younger people to do that. So a lot of it was spent within the community, helping the community and helping them with organising the sandbagging day, because there was thousands and thousands and thousands of sandbags done. While we were there, we had a couple of what I'd call mini tornadoes came through, and you can see 2 houses there where the roofs were just ripped off. So we deployed operators in our vehicles with the SES crews to those sites. We used a local repeater in the Wentworth Mildura area as the primary comms, because it was available to us and it was operational, and it wasn't in an area where it was going to get flooded or lose power. So we had fairly reliable 2-meter comms on the ground while we were there. So there's a couple of other photos. A lot of it was also spent just in general, after hours with our comrades from the SES, just enjoying sharing stories and spending some time with them. They were from, as I said, all over the country, and all had come, giving their time freely to come and volunteer and do the work that was being done in that Wentworth area. So if someone says to you, WICEN hasn't been used since 1983, well, you can inform them it was 2022. One thing I will briefly talk about is some history here. RECOM became MCOM and then became WICEN's Special Comms Unit. This is part of a presentation by John, VK3ZRX, that I've plagiarized, John, so thank you for that. So RECOM was established in 1997 to assist the Red Cross. They had a need to secure reliable comms from disaster areas, and the main activity was evacuation or evacuee registration. And they had some other needs. But RECOM was disbanded due to the change in legislation where the Red Cross was no longer required to get evacuees' names. I mean, everyone with a cell phone today can log on to DFAC's site and say, I'm okay, or check in on Facebook. So that went away. And RECOM became part of the EMCOM group, and then merged into the Special Comms Unit within WICEN. And we have a presence in the South Pacific. But the organisational model of RECOM back in the day was a small group of amateurs. There was only about 12 to 14 involved. That included scientists, engineers, mathematicians, programmers. And it was a purposely built system for high performance emergency communication comms. Although it was principally for the Red Cross, it had some other uses. It was long range, it was independent of any infrastructure, it was secure, it was robust and reliable, it was auditable, and fast deployment. And people like the Victorian coroner requires things like it has to be audible. If there was a need to check messages that they were sent, there had to be traceability. As I said, it was extremely robust, minimal channel occupancy. It had transparent encryption. It was able to send email and post it also to the internet. So a client, being someone like the Red Cross, could actually call up a URL, click on a map, see where the operators were, and see what traffic was being sent. All data and metadata stored for later access. So what was the system? It was HF radio, active frequency management. It used PACTOR 2 and 3 with special firmware, some special software. It had extremely strong rolling key encryption, network security, GPS time synced, and all transactions recorded in secured files. So that's a little further there. There's what the kits look like. So these were, this was a fly kit, because quite often the teams were deployed, given very short times, literally within 6 hours, be out at the airport. There's a Hercules, Caribou taking off, be on that plane, and off they went to places. And we'll get to some more stuff later. So up on the Bureau of Meteorology website, EMCOM has its own propagation forecast charts. I don't know if anyone's ever seen those, but they're on there for everyone to use. So EMCOM was, EMCOM was 140 activations in 14 years. So they did a hell of a lot of mileage, mainly fires and floods. They covered all over Australia, out of Victoria. The system never failed. They never had a failure. And the 2003 fires, the only comms out of Omeo were from the EMCOM system for all agencies. So they had quite a lot of use back in the day. There were several network gateway stations where the location was chosen for diversity. They operated 24/7, and they scanned fixed frequencies from 160 through to 15 meters. Today, there is one station in Traralgon that is fully operational as a station that's up and running 24/7. There was an additional station in Darwin, but due to not being used a lot and the operator relocated, that was closed down a few years ago. So there is a presence in the South Pacific. that is what the station looks like. John ZRX, that's VK3 AEN/N node down in Traralgon. That's what John's station looks like for the MCOM system. The system was used in 2019. So there was a request for assistance from Rotuma. Rotuma is an island, I guess 300 miles out of Fiji. Rotuma has a population of about 1,600 people. If anyone's into a lot of digital FT8, you might know Anton 3D2AG. He's quite a well-known amateur radio operator in Fiji. He was out on Rotuma. There was a tropical storm nearby. There was very limited phone and no internet. So we received a request from Anton on the system, and that's how it looks. He posted that message. So when you look at the web page, there is the message. Hey, I need some support. I don't know whether the cyclone's going to come down on us. Can you? So the station, high power station, was spun up. The storm became Tropical Cyclone Sari, and over the next 7 days, we provided detailed weather data on a 2-hourly basis to Anton, who was receiving it on his HF system, his laptop and his radio. The info he was able to relay to other islands, and Tropical Cyclone Sari passed southwest of Rotuma, headed to Fiji. Then there was tragedy. And I'm not going to go into that, but sadly, Anton's son drowned on the island, and Anton was able to use the system as a way to communicate to the outside world of what took place. So you can see there a real life use or real practical use for one of the systems. So essentially, WICEN uses 3 primary digital systems. One is called TRACK. Paul Elvey, VK3 YYF, developed a system called TRACK. It's good for tracking people. So a lot of our training events where we may be tracking motorcycle riders, runners, which in a disaster might be we're tracking vehicles or people. We use a system called TRACK, and that's typically used on VHF, UHF. It's a packet system, and quite a good system, and often underused with its capability. We do use WinLink. So that's a system that we train in and are familiar with to use. And today there are a lot of other systems. If people are into digital modes, there's things like JS8 Call. I love using VARA AC, but there's obviously WinLink and with VARA now, a whole lot of other digital modes available. And of course the MCOM system that I just described. So they're typically the 3 digital systems that WICEN use and train in. But we are also a community-based organisation, and we use events as training exercises to help sharpen the skills, and we do a lot of these events every year. Some are no longer. I was actually talking to a guy today who's a bit of a runner, and I've never done the Oxfam, but he said it's the last Oxfam this weekend. That's not going to be run anymore, but that was an event WICEN used to do until mobile phones made it easier for them to do what they needed to do. But where we still do a lot of events, it's either in areas where communications is very difficult, like the high country, or, sorry? Yep. The Great Alpine, or the Alpine Rally, doesn't run anymore. That ran its 100th, I think, 2 years ago or a year ago, and that's not running anymore. So in the Alpine areas where communications is very difficult, or where maybe there are insurance requires them to have a secondary communications network. So they primarily might be using their phones. But say, for example, with the Australian Rally Championships, which is held down in Hayfield and will be held again this year, they have some fantastic satellite-based systems called Rally Safe. You know, there's antennas on top of cars, under cars, and you know when a car rolls because immediately the computer screen in front of you is saying it's just pulled 9G and the driver's hit the big red button. But they still require us to be there as a secondary network. At one rally event, I think it was 2 years ago, where they were holding the rally in a particular stage, their system failed them. It was the Great Alpine Rally. Their system failed them up in Omeo, I think we were. And on that particular day, they had a rollover, and we were the primary comms to support them. So, yeah, we don't just do events and we sit there and we don't get used. Quite often we do get used, but sometimes you don't. And sometimes when you're not being used, it's for the right reason, because you don't want to see somebody hurting themselves. Even though it's great to see a car roll over, but not always do you want that to happen. So just a couple of pictures from some of our events. Excuse me. So quite often you get the opportunity to get away from the kids and you get to hang out in the swag for the night. I thoroughly enjoy that. There's a bit of a setup down the bottom left-hand corner. That was in my car from one event. I think my job that day was just to monitor a whole lot of radio traffic, so it was lovely. Picture down the bottom left-hand corner is actually Luke's from a car rally where he came on his bike, and that was his loadout on his motorbike. And there's obviously a car that's been in a rollover, and one of our other members there out with his radio in the bush. So the important thing for training, you get to know your equipment, you get to know what you've left at home. You get to understand about shelter, especially environmentally, if it's hot, cold. You pack out your food and water. You learn a lot about navigation. And there was an event that used to be held called the Pajero Rally. I can remember being up in one of the state forests, and this was about 9 o'clock at night. It was pitch dark. The checkpoint I was on was like, there was 3 big bog holes, and when the 4-wheel drives pulled up, they had a choice of going through bog hole 1, 2, or 3, and some of them were like 40 meters long and up to the windows of the cars. If they went through that one, they got maximum points. It was that sort of thing. Next minute, about 8 cars turned up, and I thought, oh, well, we've got some event organizers turning up to come and have a look. It was a group of people that came off the Black Spur out into the forest, had no navigation, realized when they lost their cell phone coverage, they lost their Google Maps, and they were lost. 9, 10 o'clock at night, out in the middle of the forest, and they're lost. Fortunately, they came across us, and they were able to follow out one of the organisers. But the importance of navigation, having a comms plan. Is anyone familiar with the acronym PACE? And I'm not talking about pacemakers. Primary, auxiliary, contingency, emergency. PACE. It's a term that a lot of military communication planning uses. It's something that I've adopted in a lot of things in my life, not just radio communications, but a lot of things I do. So you've got a backup to the backup to the backup to the backup. So our communications plan, and I've never not been able to communicate on an event. So we may have our primary communications might be through a local repeater, or it might be through a repeater that we've set up. Our auxiliary communications might be a simplex frequency. A lot of the events we do, especially motorcycle riders, they'll have UHF-CB. And in a lot of events, will also use UHF-CB, like the Stockman's Rally, 400 motorbike riders, the medics, and a lot of the sweeps, they'll carry UHF-CB. So they'll come across a rider that's down needing medical attention and will be monitoring UHF-CB. So, and then you might have your emergency, and that might be your phone, might be a sat phone or another means of communication. So every time I go up in the high country, I'll activate my Garmin satellite device. So that's my emergency. That's my last means of communication. And as you saw from the picture earlier, I have a nice digital radio set up in the car, so I can use WinLink and a lot of other digital modes if needed. You get familiar with the people you're working with. You get to train in near real world conditions, because you don't get to choose when a disaster happens. It can be 2 degrees and it's raining. You don't get to say, oh, we won't go this weekend, we'll go next weekend. A lot of it becomes muscle memory. You just know what to do because you've trained. And of course, we hope we will never need to use what we've trained for in the real world. So an operator typically is someone who's passionate about public service, because you don't get paid for this. It's not a job, it's not a career. You're a volunteer, and quite often some of the downfalls where amateur radio has been used in emergency communications, not only in Victoria but in other states, from people I've spoken to, is when people aren't passionate about what they're doing and they have either abandoned their post or chosen that they don't like what they're doing. And we're there to serve. We're not there to please ourselves. So if someone says your job today is to make coffee and hand out sausage sandwiches to a bunch of people, we're happy to do it. And we have some fun with that on a few of the events we do. There's a particular medic on a motorbike event. Everyone knows The Rock, the actor. Well, he's a smaller version of him called Pierre. And every year I take donuts and coffee for him, except last year I forgot the donuts. So, you know, we have fun with that. You've got to be available, as you saw from the earlier Wentworth deployment. It doesn't always suit everyone all the time. Life gets in the way, work, family, but you've got to be available. You can't just say, oh yeah, this is on, that's on. You've got to be flexible. Sometimes with deployments or exercises, you can think you're going to be there for 3 days and it might be 2 days, or you think you might be going to checkpoint A and somebody's broken down on the way, or they've called sick that morning and now you're being redeployed to somewhere else. So now you're not hanging out with someone you thought you're going to be on your own for the night. So you've got to be flexible and adaptable. Got to be diplomatic. Obviously, sometimes you're dealing with like motorcycle riders who have fallen off, who want to ride out. You know that as soon as they ride down that hill, they're going to fall off the bike and break their neck. So you're often trying to also talk with people. So you've got to be diplomatic, self-sufficient, because you're out there on your own often. We operate in all conditions and willing and able. And yeah. So we're going to now talk about the white elephant in the room, or the thin-grained line. And this is a little bit of a point of discussion, we'll say. And that's why amateur radio operators are less likely, and I've changed that from the last time I gave this, less likely to be used within a disaster response by agencies. And I'm talking generically here, amateur radio operators. You just can't run out the door with your bofang and turn up and say, I'm an amateur radio operator. Australia is not the US or a third world country. And I hope by what I talked about earlier about the state emergency response plan and that framework, that gives a little bit of context to that. In America, for example, there's over 16,000 individual police forces or agencies. 16,000. They're all trained differently. I think the average number of hours for a police officer or months in the US is something like 3 to 4 months worth of training. You know, here it's like at least a year, or if not 2. So we aren't the United States. So If you've fallen into the trap of watching YouTube and seeing what's going on into the United States and think that that's what goes on here, you're wrong. The agencies in Australia have developed technologies and networks that have minimal downtime and have proven in recent fire seasons. For example, New South Wales government recently put out a press release. They're spending, I don't know what it is, 180 million. Every SES and New South Wales fire rescue vehicle radio system. If the RF comms go down, it automatically switches to satellite, and with the press of a button, they now have a Wi-Fi bubble around the vehicle for everyone to jump on their phones. Similar technology exists here in Victoria. You know, whether you call it SAT-CALS or whatever acronym, there is enough technology within and money being spent for interoperability and all those other things. Yes, towers get burned over. Yes, roads go down and they can't get in there to refuel gensets and all that sort of stuff. But they've got a pretty robust radio network today. I'm not talking about 1980 and back then, but today. Obviously, you've got to be fit to go to work. You can't turn up to a disaster saying, hey, I'm here to respond, and you're on a ventilator. You've got to be fit to work, and that's different for everyone. There are some extremely fit 80-year-olds, and there are some very unfit 30-year-olds. So you've got to be fit for work. There is insurance liabilities obviously associated with organisations that turn up. And unless you're trained with those agencies, whatever training you've done, I've ran a net on a Sunday night for the last year, your training's not going to be aligned with that of the agencies that you're there working with. And you're not integrated into the emergency management or the SEMP into that plan. So if you're not in that plan, they're not going to know you and they're not going to want you there. They're going to ask you to leave. The baseline future envisioned for emergency volunteering in the community, and I'm not going to read that, but it was an article produced or a paper produced, several papers were produced by RMIT in 2019 around volunteering. And anyone who's been involved with volunteering knows how hard it is to get volunteers today, whether it's your local footy club, the radio club, WICEN. Volunteering is not in a great place. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it in country areas is back when families owned farms and the kids stayed on the farms. Now they're owned by large corporations with FIFO, fly in, fly out sort of managers, and they've got nothing invested in the local community. So even people like the CFA in regional areas and SES struggle with. I think when we're up in Wentworth, the Wentworth SES at that time, I think had 4 or 6 members, and I think 4 of them, Dad and his 3 boys, were 4 of them. So it's tough for all volunteers. So yeah. The Rock, Now We Build. I've not seen the movie, but yeah, it's not quite as simple as Now We Build, but let's talk a little bit about resilience. So after that disaster has taken place, the response, and there's the recovery phase, we talk about resilience. And that's the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to a hazard to basically bounce back. And resilience can be physical, it can be psychological, it can be economical. There's a whole lot of stuff that can go into resilience. And your local council, and there's 79 of them in Victoria, all have a role to play in emergency management. And councillors are given a document. There is a document for councillors to understand their obligations. And if you go to your local council's website, there will be an emergency response plan that the council has. And this is leading somewhere where I think amateur radio clubs, whether it's EMDRC or any other club, can have an important role to play in the community. Because while I, on one hand, look at the legislative framework the money and the resources that the agencies have, which is disproportionate to what emergency communications from an amateur radio perspective can offer. There is a lot of talent in amateur radio clubs from a whole raft of disciplines, whether it be from people's working life or the fact that there's a common bond with technology. So the Municipal Emergency Management Planning Group is a group that exists within every council, and they have this MPEC meeting. WICEN used to be heavily involved in all these MPEC meetings. We used to have representatives on these. A few years ago, they changed the rules, and it was around making those MPECs more accountable for them getting together. It wasn't, they didn't get together monthly to have donuts and coffee. They got together monthly to have some real serious conversations around how they're going to support their communities, and to make them accountable for that. They couldn't have as many people on those, and a lot of the roles on those committees were filled with police and SES and fire, for example. So WICEN is not on as many of these community committees as we once were. But the importance of community-based clubs is obviously amateur radio is a science-based hobby. Operators have a common competency based on the training and being on air. You have a local knowledge of your community, and you're integrated into your community. I mean, most people here would live in the area. No one here has travelled probably more than an hour to be here. So you live in the community where your club is. If there is a disaster, support will come from outside the disaster zone in that response and recovery phrases. And your club might be asked to go to another region to support an area. And a good thinking about that is 2.5 weeks ago, and it's not a question that I have an answer for. I don't know why the emergency relief centres weren't opened sooner, but I'm not across all that detail. But there's a great opportunity there for volunteers from amateur radio clubs to be at work with their local councils and to be at those emergency relief centres. What is one of the biggest thing that people want when they come along to those things? Can somebody recharge my phone? Who knows about batteries here? I'd say everyone. Who knows how to, get a 100 amp hour lithium battery and make sure it's charged, or an SLA, and have a couple of USB charging points. We all do that all the time. So there's some great talent to help in that space with, and if you're somebody who's into POTA or SOTA, or lighthouses on the air, you're probably someone who likes a bit of camping, so you know how to get a jet boil out or boil kettle. I saw some people on the news going, we can't even make a cup of tea because they've got no electricity, you've got no gas. And a lot of those people up in the hills and in the country areas, they've got tank water, so no electricity, no pump runs. And we'll talk about preparedness in a moment, but great opportunity for clubs to get involved with their local council and help out at those relief centres. So how can your club integrate and support WICEN in that, and how can we help you both ways? Think of the micro use of your club in the response and recovery phases in your local community. And your local community is not necessarily Burwood, up in Belgrave and Selby and Alinda. I know there are clubs up in the hills, but maybe those clubs aren't doing that sort of thing, and they've got their own problems anyhow, because they're without power at home. They've got trees down across roads and they can't get out of their houses. You lowlanders have a perfect opportunity to travel no more than 40 minutes up the road and provide support to those communities up in the hills with the talent that you have. And I said additional resources will also come from outside. And one thing that I've always said is we'll be measured by our inactions rather than our actions. So it's not for everyone, but sitting around and doing nothing, you'll be equally as measured for that as you will if you do something. So just a couple of short stories to kind of wrap up. But before we do, preparedness. All activities undertaken in advance of an occurrence of an incident. So living up in the Dandenongs as I do, I have a bit of a joke with my my partner. We're not married legally, but been together 20 years. And I said to her a couple of years ago, if you come with me to PrepperCon in America, I'll marry you. And she said, I'm not going to PrepperCon. I like to think that I'm a prepper, but without the tinfoil hat. So preparedness, you know, we have a generator at home. So when we lost that power for those 5 days, we're able to run our freezer and fridge and charge things and charge laptops. We have water available to us. We have gas cooking available to us. We have lighting available to us at home that can all be easily deployed when we have a storm come through. So a lot of people aren't prepared, and the types of things that amateur radio operators typically do fall into that area of preparedness, especially again if you're a SOTA or a POTA, you know, that sort of operator. You know about batteries and charging them and doing all that stuff. One of the things, I spoke to a lady, I got bailed up by a lady the other day in Belgrave South who saw all the antennas on the car, and she came over and she was all shaken up by the storm and things, and she was talking about communications. You know, what can we do? And, you know, I couldn't get a cell phone signal out, and obviously they're not going to get their amateur radio license. And even if they did get their amateur radio license, who are they going to call? You know, from their Bofang in the hills, would they hit 3REC or, you know, no one's necessarily listening to a frequency in a disaster. But there are a lot of things radio can be used in those communities. And I've spoken with some other clubs previously about people come along and talk about UHF-CB. Well, how can I install that at home? One of the things that we all do is raise your hand if you haven't put an antenna up. Raise your hand if you've not. You've all done it as part of your license when we have to connect the radio to the antenna and to the battery. And that's what they need to have that sort of education given to them. And we talked about comms plans. Well, they can, win their local community, maybe there's 4 or 5 of them that have UHF radios at home, and they can form a little cluster and jump on their radio on channel 39 and go, you know, 10-4 big buddy, is anyone there? We've lost power. So there's that sort of advice and training and help. And maybe out of that, somebody gets the spark and says, hey, I want to become an amateur radio operator. But, so there's a lot of things that clubs can do in helping their local community. I'm going to talk about a story, and I have permission to talk about this. I spoke with somebody before about don't believe everything you read. My 12-year-old boy knows 2 things: not to believe everything dad says to him, or actually 3 things. Don't believe everything on the internet, and certainly don't believe everything your Uncle Stuart tells you. And the reason for that, I say that, is not everything you read on the internet is true. I like to think that before we post things, we fact check. You know, if the club's having a boot sale, you know, you might check the newsletter, or you might check with the president or the secretary. Are we having that on this Saturday? A lot of people post things on Facebook, and it's not true. And I came across this story, and I don't have my notes, but I'll just paraphrase it. So if anyone in this room doesn't know VK5 Papa Alpha Sierra, then you've been living under a rock. So I saw a post from Paul on Facebook the other day, and if I get some of the facts wrong, I apologize, Paul, but I have spoken to Paul and I asked him if I could share this story. He was running the answer net, I think 20 meters, and he put the call out. A lot of people came back, as they do. You've probably been on the net. He got around to somebody in the group and they said, oh, I've actually got a bit of a problem. I'm so-and-so on the whatever highway between, I think, Darwin and somewhere, and I've broken down and I need some help. Why the operator didn't go pan or break and get in first while there was propagation, I don't know, maybe. But he spoke to Paul. Paul did the right thing. He dropped down 5 kc and then had a conversation with him. Now you could, and Paul cancelled a doctor's appointment that he had, phoned his daughter to let her know that he and his wife were okay but broken down, and he also phoned the RACV equivalent to get roadside assistance, which was going to take, I think, at least 24 hours for where they were. So you could give that some context and go, amateur radio saved the day. Well, did it really save the day? Why didn't he have a satellite phone? Why didn't he have a way of sending an email using, say, WinLink? Why didn't he have a Garmin InReach two-way communicator, or a 27 meg or UHF radio? Or why didn't he ask a fellow traveller who was passing by to help? Because he wasn't remote, there were people coming by. Now, he didn't want to get out of his car initially because of traffic, and there was some things, but be prepared. Amateur radio didn't save the day. Communication saved the day. His phone wasn't working where he was, but he was able to get a message out. So it doesn't matter if you're using, UHF handheld CB between a couple of houses up in the Dandenongs. If that gets a message out that brings assistance to someone, well, being a communicator, a critical thinker, being prepared, being a prepper, that saved the day, not necessarily amateur radio. So I'm just sharing that from what was online. You could see that being posted everywhere about, oh, amateur radio, how fantastic. Well, the other side of that coin was that particular operator wasn't prepared for the travel he was undertaking in a remote area of Australia. What happens if 20 meters, the propagation wasn't there? Well, he didn't have other bands, may have not had other bands fully available to him. So it was more luck than good planning that helped him. So here's another little story of a motocross enduro event. It was a multiple day event, and it was being held up in the Victorian High Country. Just say there was poor preparedness from the event organisers. On the second day of the event, I was in the radio room, which was a unair-conditioned hut, and it was a very hot day. And the clerk of the course, who was the person responsible for running the event, made a passing comment that a motorcyclist had fallen. And it was like, hello, what? Oh yeah, someone's fallen. The person who had fallen was a 16-year-old female rider. She had fallen off the main track in the high country, so on a single trail, and there was no communications with her. So we were able to contact our operator closest to that area, and he was able to relay to some of the officials on motorbikes that they needed to go back up against oncoming traffic and to deal with what they could find, which they were able to do. They got to the rider and found she was in need of immediate medical attention. Wouldn't say she was critical, but heading towards critical. they were able to get that message back to us. Now, due to the poor planning, remember we talked about pace? One of the things the organisers had failed to do was to ensure that Melbourne Ambulance had an event commander who was there every day and was the same person. So on day 2, we've got a new Melbourne Ambulance event commander who was a lovely guy who introduced himself in the morning. He was handed a satellite phone by the organisers. Well, satellite phones don't always work well in the high country, especially under foliage. If you're not trained in the use of that phone, it's going to be pretty hard for you to figure out how to turn it on, program it, send a call. So they tried him on his personal cell phone, the event commander from Melbourne Ambulance. He was unavailable, out of range. So they tried him on the sat phone he was issued and didn't work. So earlier that morning, I'd seen the, everyone know what a troopy is? Those Land Cruiser. Yeah, it was a troopy ambulance, and it had a UHF-CV radio in it. And the is it Myrtleford or starts with M. Anyway, the ambulance station there monitors one of the frequencies, one of the channels. So I jumped on the CB radio we had, put a call out for the event commander who was out at forget the word, not Sheepyard Flat, and couldn't get hold of him. Next minute up on the radio comes, it's not Mansfield, it must be Myrtleford, is it not Mansfield? Is it Mansfield Station? Merry Jig Station here, how can we help? And I said, well, I'm after the event commander, this is who I am, blah, blah, blah. They said, all right, we'll get him on the, what is it, the SMR, the statewide radio system, which they did. They got him. He came down to us, we told him what was going on. And from there, he was able to get his ambulance crew up to where the patient was with the doctor we had. The doctor was able to assess the patient. They were able to coordinate with HEMS to get a helicopter in. Our operator, who had CFA training, was able to organise an LZ for the helicopter to land. It took something like 3 hours to extricate the patient. The doctor said, if we hadn't intervened when we did, the outcome for the patient's health would have been different, because she was bleeding out, because her blood pressure was dropping and she had an upper thigh injury. So it doesn't matter whether you're using UHF, CB to get the ball rolling, and then we're using our 2-meter links to our operators. It's the holistic approach to communications where we've trained together, and there is a certain mojo about when something happens, how we go about it. Not everyone is suitable for emergency work. You're working under duress. You may psychologically not be suitable for it, or the stressor of an event may cause ongoing mental health issues that would suggest that you shouldn't have been doing the work you were been doing. So it's not for everyone. A final thought, amateur radio plays its part by upholding willingness, if needed, in the state emergency response plan. So WICEN and our cohorts are there in case we are needed under that state emergency management plan. But that also has greater advantages for the hobby. It helps with other organisations to protect our spectrum, and clubs can gain local funding. It's more than a technical hobby. There's a practical application with the preservation of life. So I know from talking to people who have been involved in spectrum management and people who have been involved with clubs when they've gotten some funding, that the emergency communications component of our hobby holds some weight and can help. So if you're passionate like I am in wanting to see amateur radio remain as a tool within emergency management framework, then I urge you to become a member of WICEN. That's the altar call. But what we do with a lot of people from clubs is they'll come out and maybe come and do one event with us a year. And it might be their interest in rally cars, come and do the Australian Rally Championships, and they'll have a ball. And that's all we want from them, because they can take that learning back into their clubs. They can use that we get to know them, and if there is a greater need to get them involved with something, we know we can pick up the phone and say, hey, you know, we've got this going on. We know you'd be suitable because you love four-wheel driving and you've done work. So a lot of the time we're not seeking members to become members, so to speak, because we're not a club. We're an organisation. We don't get together monthly and do presentations and have hamfests and all that sort of thing. So there's typically within WICEN a core group of people that are involved in the organisational management and the emergency management side. And then we have a wide range of people who come along to events and who love coming out and playing radio and getting involved. And from time to time, people have got involved with us on technical, looking at technical things in digital systems. I know a few people have got involved recently looking at mesh networks and a whole lot of other things. So, yeah, that kind of concludes what I'd like to talk about. I think we've gone for nearly an hour and 15. So thank you for your attention span. And if there's any questions, I'd love to answer any. Can I sign you up? Just come. Any questions? Sorry, can I go there first, Martin? Got in first. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, they had a lot of questions about what radio they should get, and you know, CB radio, is that any good? And then also, do I need to have a battery radio? Was that a good idea? That sort of thing. Something like that, I think, would go down really well. And I know probably 3 weeks after I left, they were hit by a big cyclone up in Cairns, and all of what that work they put in there. There's a lot of people that were interested too. I suppose up north it's more a cyclone-prone sort of environment, so people are wondering what to do in case of that happens every year, every wet season sort of thing. But yeah, just something that maybe down here that they could, some of the local, maybe up in the hills, you know, get together and get all the local services together and just prepare all the people a bit more.
That's right. As you said, Cairns is probably a more of a cyclone prone area, and especially places like Townsville and up that way over the last few months. But up in the Dandenongs, whether it's fire or storm, over the last few years, there's been quite a lot of events that have taken place. And even if you don't live up in the hills, there are people down in, call it the lowlands, tongue in cheek, who have family that live up there. So there's always opportunity there to talk to people about preparedness and about how they best can be prepared for those events that are going to hit them. Fire that might be, they're going to get out, they're going to enact their fire plan, and they're going to leave the hills. But often with storms, they come pretty quick, and we don't expect the damage like the last one brought. They're not the sort of things where you got to evacuate everyone from the Dandenongs. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity to talk about all those things of, you know, like the last two and a half weeks ago, did not have a very reliable cell phone coverage on any of the networks. Therefore, if somebody did want to communicate with somebody, and I think that starts locally within the community, be a good neighbour, you know, go and talk to your neighbour and see what their needs are, and then how you can help others in your street and in their area. We quite often get people coming around borrowing batteries. You know, the four-wheel drive super center sort of battery boxes. I've got a few of those, and you lend those out, and yeah. Martin.
To use the other mic. Is there any, I might have missed it earlier, but is there any assistance or funding that's provided to WICEN by government agencies at all?
We don't receive any direct funding, so there's no every financial period here's your budget. We have to apply for grants like anyone else would in the same way.
Well, certainly, having benefited from a grant recently, I know the work that goes into it. So well done.
There's a lot of work that goes into preparing grants, and it's a job, specialist job on its own. As much WICEN, if my opinion, humble opinion is, we would benefit greater from having interaction with agencies and having people communicating with those agencies and people within the community, as opposed to money. We could be a lot more useful by rubbing shoulders with people within government, within those agencies and within the community to look for ways that how WICEN / amateur radio clubs can be used to provide greater resilience for the communities in that recovery phase.
Mark, we've got the usual question from Zoom. Like that's a question that I think you'll hear often. How do you operate encrypted radio under an amateur license, or are you authorized via some other instrument?
If you look in your, what was it called? Your license conditions, which is now LCD, which is now changed to our class license. We are allowed to use encrypted communications in an emergency. And the encrypted communications that, I mean, we use encrypted communications in some respect today, don't we? If you're doing FT8 or WinLink. That's correct. But if you were not from the radio community and you hear all this stuff on the radio, you'd probably just assume it's encrypted. If my wife tuned into it, she'd go, I can't understand it, so therefore it's encrypted. Yeah. We do use encrypted communications with the MCOM system, and we are allowed to.
Another comment from Zoom, which is Mark Rico 3 FMGF, suggesting that for the Hill people, we should bring back the old fire siren. So I reckon we got to put one on the roof. Yeah,
well, we have the fire. I live in Belgrave, so I hear Belgrave South, Belgrave, and Tacoma. So except when they don't have power.
So they need a handle operator.
No, they've got a generator now in Belgrave South.
I was just going to ask, some years ago, got involved with sat phones with the walking club, and I'm talking probably 20 years plus. The satellite communications, sat phone communication, reasonably priced satellite communications improved?
I would think simple answer is yes, and I know the government. And I know I've written about it, but I can't recall all the details. They had a program a few years ago where LGAs could apply for sat phones, and a lot of the LGAs now will have sat phones, and I think they're on Telstra, and they turn them on and they have reasonable bandwidth, but then if they're turning like the Wi-Fi part of it on, they can dial a number and it increases the bandwidth. That's what I've been told. So they have some fairly. They've been given the asset, so they've got the radio or the phone. It's on a plan, and gives them quite reasonable bandwidth to run laptops and phones and a whole lot of things. Okay. Yeah.
I've just got a comment there. I think, like, if you mean more for personal or hobby groups, I think what you want to look at is things like the Garmin InReach, which are where the prices are like, I haven't looked it up in a while, but it's something like $300 for the device. And then you also got to pay like $30 a month or something subscription for it. But
Garmin are very good I had another device, I've forgotten the name of it, but it was an annual plan, US dollars, and I think it was costing me up to $300 a year. But with Garmin, you can go month by month. So if you're going away into the high country or remote, you can activate it, and it's like $25 for the month. Limited messaging, expensive to use if you had to do a lot on it. Well, if that was going to be the case, you could pay the $40 for the month, and you know, it's one of those sort of plans. But if it's there as an emergency device, and really if somebody's that injured or sick or in trouble, what's a couple of $100? It's there, and it's $25, I think, to activate it for the month. Yes, it does, and I'm not sure if that's in Australia at the moment. It was, yes, in the United States, but it was coming here. But you're right. So when it goes to SOS, it defaults to a satellite functionality.
Mark, just a question. Your definition of emergency and disaster, in your opinion, was the events of 2 weeks ago an emergency or a disaster?
It was an emergency. There wasn't. If you look at the fires in Ballarat at the moment, or over the last few days, it required a lot of resourcing from outside the area. So it probably falls into that disaster definition. But up in the hills, it was. There wasn't a big need. There was, from a power sort of point of view, for crews coming in, cutting down trees and all that sort of thing. But from an emergency management point of view, I don't think there was a house lost. So it was mainly a lot of work around removal of trees, restoration of power, and communication cabling. But from a community point of view, people didn't have power, so if they needed food, they needed to travel some distance away. I know on the first day it was 4 hours for some people to get from like Selby down to Ferntree Gully. But ongoing over those few days without power, they were still wondering, how am I going to charge my phone? There's only so much driving you can do in the car with it plugged into the cigarette lighter. So, and of course, you don't want people driving around when there's trees down and power lines down. You want them to go to the local footy club if that's where the centre is. And there's a bunch of nice people to talk to who's going to make them a cup of coffee and charge their phone and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Right, sounds like we got no more questions here in the room. So a last opportunity for any questions from Zoom. Or we're gonna go and wind it down here. So over to you, Martin.
Camera range. I think, Mark, a very informative session this evening. Thank you very much. I think some of the points that were raised around preparedness are particularly relevant. I think for people of Melbourne, I know myself, I lost power for only a number of 16 hours or something. I live a kilometre away. People 2 kilometres away were out of power for over a week. We know that a lot of people these days suffer from simple things like sleep apnea, for example, and need breathing assistance at night. How many people are actually prepared for a sustained power outage? Like one night you might survive and stay awake. There's a few of us I know would be well prepared, but there's many more who aren't prepared. We're very privileged in this state, and probably this country. We're very wealthy in this respect, well resourced and equipped, but we're suffering from challenges such as maintenance of our power lines. Dare I say, weather change is climate change, whether you believe that or not. But the fact is, we lost major distribution supplies from Gippsland, and we lost power. So that's a reality. Same with fires. This club emerged out of fires many years ago in the Dandenongs, as you know. And certainly when WICEN have asked for assistance, we've helped advertise a call for help whenever we're asked. So we've got a long-standing history. A couple of things before I wind up tonight. I found this around the club. This might be something that's of interest to you. This is a very old magnetic sticker that has some history, which is
before colour, black and white TV,
which is unknown. Poor man's version, no doubt. But perhaps you'd be interested and find a use for that in your future with WICEN. And lo and behold, we did manage to dig these out, find them. A small token of our appreciation,
greatly
Mark, for
appreciated.
your presentation, Stephen. Most informative. Well done. Thank you. All right, that concludes our session this evening. Thank you very much for attending. As always, people on Zoom, feel free to make yourselves a cuppa at home. We have the urn and we actually got biscuits tonight, so feel free to make yourself a cuppa here and have a chat and be gone probably around 10 would be nice. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.